For decades, society has treated the idea of a spiritual awakening as something impossible to take seriously. If you tell someone you woke up from a dream, lost your old identity, or suddenly felt deeply connected to the universe, they might assume you are just being overly emotional, or worse, making it up. Because these events are intensely personal, it is easy to dismiss them as pure imagination. But modern research is beginning to show something really important. A spiritual awakening is not just a made-up story after all. It is a very real, highly measurable human phenomenon. Psychologists are now studying spontaneous awakenings. Neuroscientists are tracking mystical events in the lab. Trauma experts are mapping post-traumatic growth. What they are finding is that these experiences, physically and psychologically, alter perception, identity, and human behavior. So, the question we need to ask is not simply, is spiritual awakening real? The better question is, what is actually happening inside a human being when they report waking up, or more like awakening? The answer is much more serious and much more structural than most people realize. In everyday conversation, the term spiritual awakening can mean anything. People pack a lot of different things into it. Some tie it directly to religion, others link it to daily meditation. Many describe hitting it only after surviving a severe life crisis, deep isolation, or grief. But when researchers take this topic into a laboratory setting, they look at it differently. In science, a spiritual awakening is defined as a massive, sudden shift in human consciousness, meaning, and perception. A major 2021 study published in Frontiers in Psychology looked at these spontaneous shifts. They described them as sudden moments where a person feels direct contact or unity with something they perceive as an ultimate reality, or God, or the universe itself. Researchers are not trying to figure out if a person simply adopted a new belief system. They are tracking the mechanical aftershocks. How did the event change the person's baseline fear? Did their daily sense of meaning increase? Did their core values shift? Did they suddenly feel less attached to their own ego? Science might not be able to weigh or measure the spiritual realm itself, but it can absolutely study the exact pattern of what happens to a human being when they collide with it. For a long time, the only data we had on spiritual awakenings came from personal journals. They belonged to mystics, monks, or highly devoted religious figures. But psychology is finally taking the phenomenon seriously because it does not just happen to monks on mountaintops. It happens to regular people, completely out of nowhere. The same 2021 Frontiers paper investigated what they call spontaneous spiritual awakenings. These are intense, subjective events where a person suddenly experiences non-duality, the feeling that the boundary between themselves and the outside world has vanished. The researchers explicitly noted that science has ignored these events for too long, despite the fact that thousands of people report them, and they often lead to permanent upgrades in a person's well-being. But here is where the research gets incredibly grounded. It does not claim that awakening is a soft, peaceful, beautiful experience. In fact, it is often the exact opposite. Real awakening involves massive disruption. It is a psychological earthquake. People report intense emotional release, deep confusion, and the painful process of completely rebuilding their identity from scratch. It is not just positive thinking or forced gratitude. It is a violent structural shift in how a person operates in the world. If an experience is purely subjective, how do you put it under a microscope? You build a better ruler. Researchers have spent years designing specific tools to measure exactly what a mystical experience is. The most famous of these is the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. In highly controlled laboratory settings, scientists use this tool to track specific markers: a sense of unity, a feeling of deep sacredness, an overwhelming positive mood, and the temporary loss of time and space. In 2008, Johns Hopkins University ran a landmark study. They induced mystical-type experiences in participants under strict observation. When they followed up months later, the results were mind-boggling. The participants did not view the event as just a strange afternoon in a lab. They rated the experience as one of the most deeply meaningful and spiritually significant moments of their entire lives. Later, peer-reviewed validations of this questionnaire proved it to be a highly reliable tool for tracking these invisible events. Now, this does not mean a piece of paper with checkboxes can prove that a conscious universe exists, but it proves something equally important. It proves that mystical events are not too vague to study. They can be described, categorized, measured, and directly compared across completely different populations. Once a human experience can be consistently measured, it stops being a fringe story. It becomes a concrete phenomenon that science has to answer for. At the absolute core of an awakening is a profound shift in identity. It changes the fundamental sense of I. Before an awakening, most people live inside a very tight, fixed story. The story sounds like this. This is who I am. This is what I am afraid of. This is what I need to be happy. This is my reputation, and I must protect it. But during an awakening, that tight story loosens its grip. People suddenly feel less trapped inside their old personality. They stop identifying so heavily with their random daily thoughts. Dr. Andrew Newberg, a pioneer in the field of neurotheology, has spent years studying the brain during spiritual states. He notes that the most common thread in these reports is the total transformation, or even the temporary loss, of the ordinary sense of self. Many ancient traditions call this ego dissolution. Modern psychology uses different terminology, but they are pointing at the exact same target. The mental model of the self drops away. The person realizes their old identity was simply too small. They stop operating out of fear and social approval. A spiritual awakening only becomes real when the old version of the self no longer feels like the whole picture. For a lot of people, an awakening does not start on a meditation cushion. It starts in the dark. It is often triggered by intense suffering, severe trauma, physical illness, or a complete emotional breakdown. Science actually has a name for this mechanism: post-traumatic growth. The research strongly supports the idea that devastating life events can force a positive, permanent spiritual shift. A major review of post-traumatic growth found that facing severe trauma frequently leads to a massive deepening of personal spirituality. People use it to survive the darkest moments of their lives. Separate studies tracking the recovery of severe burn victims found that those who leaned into spiritual frameworks demonstrated far greater psychological growth after the problem. Trauma. We see the exact same data in recent studies involving cancer patients. Their physical trauma frequently triggered a deep spiritual well-being and a complete reevaluation of what matters. It is vital to be careful here. Trauma is not a good thing. Suffering is not a requirement for growth, and severe pain can deeply damage a human being. But the research is clear. For some people, after the initial shock, after the support and the time to heal, the destruction of their old life forces a massive upgrade in compassion and spiritual awareness. For many, an awakening is not caused by comfort. It begins precisely when the old way of living completely stops working. A true spiritual awakening is not defined by a 10-minute feeling of bliss. It is defined by the permanent hardware changes left behind when the event is over. People who experience these shifts report becoming drastically less materialistic. They become highly aware of their own mortality, vastly more empathetic, and deeply focused on internal meaning rather than external success. The Frontiers research on spontaneous awakenings highlights this specifically. These events produce drastic, long-term shifts in how a person views the entire world. We see the exact same data in people who survive near-death experiences. A 2025 report covering research out of the University of Virginia showed that individuals who brush against death almost universally report a massive reduction in the fear of dying, alongside a total overhaul of their spiritual beliefs. But again, the data keeps us grounded. The research notes that this aftermath is not always a fairy tale. Many people struggle with deep feelings of isolation because they no longer fit into their old social circles. Their old life feels like a suit of clothes that no longer fits. The ultimate test of an awakening is not what a person felt in one intense, flashing moment. The true test is the permanent trajectory change of their life moving forward. It is tempting to describe spiritual awakenings as something that exists entirely outside of the physical body. But from a scientific standpoint, every single human experience has to run through the hardware of the brain. Everything from your attention span to your emotional regulation to your perception of time is filtered through neurology. Neurotheology is the specific scientific field dedicated to studying how spiritual states change brain function. Researchers like Dr. Newberg are actively mapping how the brain alters its self-awareness and attention centers when a person feels a deep sense of universal unity. We also see clear mechanical changes in the brains of long-term meditators. Deep contemplative practices physically alter how the brain handles stress, processes self-identity, and manages fear. Pointing this out does not ruin the magic of the experience. Saying that the brain is involved does not mean we are reducing a profound spiritual event to nothing more than a chemical trick. But we cannot ignore the physical reality. If a spiritual awakening changes how you see the world, it must also change the biological lens you are looking through. Meditation does not necessarily guarantee an awakening, but it actively rewires the brain to create the exact physical conditions where an awakening is much more likely to strike. So, does the current scientific research prove that spiritual awakenings are 100% real? The most honest answer is, it entirely depends on what you mean by the word real. If you are asking, do everyday people truly go through sudden, shocking experiences that permanently transform their identity, their values, and their baseline emotional state? The answer is a definitive yes. The data backs that up completely. But if you are asking, has modern science mathematically proven the existence of a conscious universe, divine intervention, or specific energetic frequencies? The answer is no. Science has not proven that, and it may never be equipped to do so. This is a crucial distinction. Science is a tool for measuring the physical world. It is exceptional at studying the footprint of an awakening. It can perfectly map the psychological changes, the drop in anxiety, the altered brain states, and the long-term behavioral upgrades. But science cannot confirm or deny the ultimate spiritual meaning that a person attaches to that experience. Science can tell us that the person woke up. It cannot always tell us exactly what woke them. So maybe the concept of a spiritual awakening is not just a modern internet trend. Maybe it is not just a convenient label people use when they want to feel special. The clinical research shows that human beings possess the hardwired capacity to go through sudden, violent shifts in consciousness. These shifts actively dismantle the ego, permanently reduce the fear of death, and completely rewrite the way a person operates in society. The most honest conclusion we can draw is also the most fascinating. Science does not validate every single spiritual belief. It does not rubber stamp every vision, every gut feeling, or every interpretation of the divine, but it absolutely confirms that the mechanism of awakening is a real, measurable human event. And perhaps that is where the true mystery actually starts. Because if a human being can suffer a complete breakdown, question the foundation of their entire reality, and then emerge with a permanently upgraded sense of purpose and peace, then a spiritual awakening is clearly not an escape from reality. It might actually be the deepest possible way the human mind learns to finally look at reality clearly.